The cold metal shackles bit into his wrists, a sharp contrast to the sweat trickling down his skin. Ethan Hayes, once a decorated soldier of Earth's last resistance, now stood in the heart of an alien battleship, a prisoner of war. The air smelled of burnt ozone and unfamiliar chemicals, a constant reminder that he was far from home. The alien guards flanking him were towering creatures with dark chitinous armor and glowing red eyes. The Yeltraks, ruthless conquerors who had torn through Earth's defenses like a blade through cloth. They had declared humanity an inferior race, weak and unworthy of survival. Yet Ethan had fought, led his people in battle. And now he was the last survivor of his unit. His brothers in arms had died screaming as plasma fire tore through them. He could still hear the echoes of their last breaths. He clenched his jaw, suppressing the surge of grief. He couldn't afford to mourn. Not now. He was still breathing, and that meant he still had a chance. The Yeltrak's general, a monstrous being with jagged mandibles and a cold, calculating gaze, observed Ethan like a scientist studying a failed experiment. Human. The creature rasped, its voice like grinding metal. You fought well, but your resistance is over. Your kind is finished. Ethan said nothing. He knew better than to waste breath arguing. The Yeltraks thrived on superiority, on breaking their enemies' spirits before crushing them completely. The general motioned to one of his subordinates. A large screen flickered to life in front of Ethan. His heart clenched as he saw the footage. It was Earth, his home, engulfed in flames. Cities lay in ruins, their once glistening skyscrapers reduced to molten metal. Ships burned in orbit, humanity's fleets scattered like ashes in the wind. The planet that had raised him, the only home he had ever known, was dying. A guttural laugh rumbled from the general. Look at your people, scattered, broken, defeated. You have nothing left. Ethan's fingers curled into fists, the shackles digging deeper. Pain flared through his wrists, but he barely noticed. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. He refused to believe this was how it ended. A door slid open behind him, and a new figure entered. Unlike the monstrous Yeltraks, this one was smaller, more refined. A woman. No, an alien, but humanoid in appearance. Her skin was a shade of deep violet, her silver eyes sharp and calculating. She wore a uniform of high-ranking status, sleek and adorned with insignias Ethan couldn't read. The general addressed her with a tone of mild amusement. Ah, Commander Vena, come to witness the fall of humanity. She studied Ethan with an expression he couldn't decipher. I came to assess the prisoner, she replied coolly. Her voice carried an odd melody, soft yet firm. Ethan met her gaze and saw something flicker in her eyes. It wasn't mockery like the others. It wasn't amusement. It was curiosity. The general waved a dismissive claw. Do as you wish. This one will die soon enough. Vena stepped closer, circling him like a predator sizing up prey. But there was something in the way she moved, something different from the rest. She wasn't just here to mock him. She was observing. Ethan knew an opportunity when he saw one. He kept his expression impassive, but his mind worked fast. If she was different, if there was even a sliver of doubt in her about the Yeltrax's cause, he could use it. She stopped in front of him, tilting her head slightly. You fought against impossible odds, she said. Why? Ethan held her gaze. Because we don't give up. A beat of silence passed between them. Then, to his surprise, her lips twitched, almost like the ghost of a smile. But before she could respond, the general barked a harsh command, and two guards grabbed Ethan roughly, yanking him away. Enough. Take him to the holding cells, the general ordered. He will be executed at sunrise. Ethan barely resisted as he was dragged down the cold metallic halls of the battleship, not because he had given up, but because he had learned something valuable. The Yeltraks saw humanity as weak, broken. They thought he was just another defeated soldier, another body waiting to be discarded. They were wrong. And Commander Vena, she was watching him. That meant she wasn't entirely convinced. Ethan had 6 hours until sunrise. He wasn't going to die in chains. Ethan sat in the dimly lit cell, his back against the cold metal wall, his hands still bound. The walls hummed with the low vibrations of the massive warship as it drifted through space. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his mind was racing. He had 6 hours before they dragged him out and executed him. 6 hours to find a way out of this mess. His body ached from the battle before his capture, bruises forming under his torn uniform. His lip was split, dried blood cracking every time he moved his mouth. But pain was secondary. Right now, all that mattered was survival. The Yeltrax were arrogant, convinced of their victory. That arrogance was their weakness. Ethan knew they wouldn't expect him to fight back. They saw him as a broken soldier, a defeated enemy waiting for death. But they didn't understand humans. He glanced at the force field securing his cell. Beyond it, the hallway stretched in both directions, empty for now. The guards would come eventually, but he needed more than brute force to escape. He needed help. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. He tensed, readying himself, expecting a group of Yeltrax guards to haul him away. Instead, a single figure stopped outside his cell. Commander Vena. She stood there for a moment, her silver eyes studying him, unreadable as before. Then, with a flick of her hand, she deactivated the force field and stepped inside. Ethan didn't move. This was unexpected, but he wouldn't show his surprise. "You have 6 hours," she said quietly, arms crossed. "Maybe less." He smirked, shifting slightly. "Yeah, I got that part." She tilted her head, watching him. "You don't seem afraid." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Fear doesn't help. Plans do." Vena's expression remained neutral. "Then you're lucky." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Because I have a plan." Now that was interesting. He sat forward, intrigued. "You want to help me?" Her gaze flickered to the doorway before returning to him. "I want to survive." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Vena exhaled sharply, almost irritated. "The Yeltrax think they've won. But they don't just conquer planets. They destroy them. And anyone who questions them." She paused, then shook her head. "They don't just kill humans, Ethan. They kill anyone who isn't useful to them, even their own allies." He studied her carefully. This wasn't just about him. It was about her too. "You're afraid they'll turn on you," he said. Her jaw tightened. "I've seen what they do. If I don't act now, I won't have a future." Ethan leaned back against the wall. "So let me guess. You break me out, and I help you escape." Vena didn't respond immediately, but he could see the answer in her eyes. She needed him just as much as he needed her. "The Yeltrax won't let me leave," she admitted. "Not without a distraction. You're a perfect one." Ethan smirked. "Glad to be of service." She glanced at the shackles on his wrists, then pulled a small device from her belt. A quick scan, and the cuffs beeped before unlocking with a metallic click. He rolled his wrists, rubbing the sore skin. "You get me out of here," he said, "and I'll make sure neither of us dies today." Vena didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smirk crossed her lips. She turned toward the door. "Follow me. And stay quiet." Ethan stood, stretching slightly before moving behind her. His muscles were stiff, but adrenaline was already pushing the pain away. The hallway was still empty, but Vena moved with precision, leading him through a series of corridors with the confidence of someone who knew the ship's every detail. They passed several locked doors, their footsteps light against the metal floor. Then, as they turned a corner, Vena suddenly halted, raising a hand. Ethan stopped instantly. 2 Yeltrax guards stood ahead, their backs to them. Vena leaned in close, whispering, "We need to take them out quietly." Ethan grinned. "I like where this is going." Before she could argue, he moved. Swift, calculated. He grabbed the first guard from behind, locking an arm around its throat. The creature let out a strangled hiss, struggling, But Ethan tightened his grip. The second guard turned, alarmed, but Vena was already on it, a sleek energy blade flashing in her hand. One precise strike, and the guard crumpled, unconscious. Ethan held his target until the creature's body finally went limp. He let it drop silently to the floor. Vena glanced at him. Efficient. He wiped his hands on his tattered uniform. I try. She didn't waste time responding. Instead, she moved to the security panel beside a nearby door, fingers flying over the controls. Ethan watched as the screen flashed red, then turned green. The ship's security systems are linked, she explained. If I disable the tracking sensors, we'll have a better chance at reaching the hangar. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And how do we get past all the guards between here and the hangar? Vena smirked. We don't. Before he could question her, she pressed a final button. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed along the corridors. Ethan's eyes widened. You triggered the alarms. False security breach, she corrected. It'll send the guards running to the wrong decks, leaving the hangar unguarded. Ethan let out a low chuckle. Clever. She gestured toward the hallway. Then move. They ran. The alarms masked their footsteps, the corridors eerily empty as they moved toward the lower levels. The warship was massive, but Vena navigated it with ease, leading them through maintenance tunnels and side passages. Every second counted. As they neared the hangar, Ethan slowed slightly, catching his breath. So what's next? Vena pointed ahead. One of the scout ships. Small. Fast. It'll get us off the warship. Ethan exhaled. And after that? For the first time, Vena hesitated. We figure it out. He studied her for a moment. She wasn't just risking her life. She was betraying her own people. But right now, she was his only ally. He nodded. Good enough for me. With one final sprint, they reached the hangar doors. It was time to escape. The alarm still blared as Ethan and Vena crouched near the entrance to the hangar, their breathing controlled but tense. The warship was massive, but this was their only chance. The false security breach had sent most of the guards running in the wrong direction, but the hangar was still patrolled by at least half a dozen Yeltrac soldiers. Worse, a large security turret hung from the ceiling, scanning for unauthorized movement. Ethan studied the situation quickly. That's a lot of firepower between us and that scout ship. Vena's silver eyes were locked onto the turret. We can't fight them directly. We have to outmaneuver them. Ethan let out a slow breath, flexing his fingers. Then we're going to need a distraction. Vena glanced at him, her expression unreadable. What are you suggesting? He smirked. Something stupid. Before she could argue, Ethan pushed himself up and stepped out into the open. Immediately, one of the Yeltrac's guards spotted him and let out a guttural snarl. The others turned, weapons raised. Vena cursed under her breath, but Ethan was already moving. He sprinted toward a stack of supply crates, drawing the guards' attention. They shouted in their guttural language, opening fire. Energy bolts scorched the air behind him as he dived, rolling behind cover. The security turret swiveled, its mechanical eye locking onto the commotion. Cover me, Ethan shouted. Vena didn't hesitate. She raised her energy blade, slashing a nearby power panel. Sparks erupted, and suddenly, the hangar's lights flickered wildly. The security turret stuttered for a moment, confused by the sudden system error. Ethan seized the opportunity. He grabbed a discarded Yeltrax blaster from the ground and fired at a stack of fuel canisters across the hangar. The explosion sent a shockwave through the bay, knocking several guards off their feet. Smoke billowed, creating temporary cover. Vena was already moving. She dashed toward the scout ship, slicing down one of the remaining guards with ruthless efficiency. Ethan followed, weaving through the chaos. The remaining Yeltracs were regrouping, but they were too slow. They'd reached the scout ship. It was sleek, designed for speed rather than combat, perfect for a quick escape. Vena slammed her hand against the control panel, forcing the doors open. Inside. Now. Ethan didn't argue. He jumped into the cockpit, scanning the unfamiliar controls. "Tell me you know how to fly this thing." Vena pushed past him, her fingers gliding over the console with practiced ease. "I do, but we need time to launch." Ethan glanced out the window. The remaining Yeltrax soldiers were already recovering, sprinting toward the ship. The security turret had recalibrated and was locking onto them. "Yeah, we don't have time," Ethan muttered. He grabbed the blaster again, took a steady breath, and aimed at the turret. One shot wouldn't take it down, but he didn't need to destroy it, just disable it long enough for them to escape. He fired. The shot hit the turret's sensor array, causing it to spark violently. It whirred in confusion, its targeting systems disrupted. Vena's voice cut through the noise. "Strap in." Ethan barely had time to drop into the co-pilot's seat before the ship roared to life. The engines flared, shaking the entire hangar. The ship lurched forward, hovering above the ground as Vena activated the thrusters. Outside, the Yeltrax opened fire. Blaster rounds slammed against the hull, but the ship's shields absorbed most of the impact. Ethan saw one of the guards rushing toward a control panel, probably to lock the hangar doors. "Not today," Ethan growled. He aimed and fired again. The console exploded in a shower of sparks, and the guard was thrown back. Vena didn't wait for permission. She slammed the throttle forward. The scout ship shot forward, engines screaming as it streaked toward the hangar's force field. The thin energy barrier was designed to keep atmosphere in while allowing ships to pass through. But at high enough speeds, it could still tear them apart. Ethan gripped the seat as the force field approached. "We're going too fast." Vena's eyes stayed locked on the display. "Trust me." The moment they hit the force field, a sudden jolt rattled the entire ship. The controls flickered. For a split second, it felt like they had hit a solid wall. Then, with a loud pop, they were through, soaring into open space. Ethan exhaled. That was insane. Vena allowed herself a small smirk. It worked. But the celebration was short-lived. A warning alarm blared through the cockpit. Ethan looked at the sensors and swore under his breath. "They're launching pursuit fighters." Vena's smirk faded. She pulled the ship into a sharp turn, heading toward an asteroid field in the distance. "Hold on." Ethan tightened his grip as the ship jerked sideways, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire. The Yeltrax fighters were fast, but their scout ship was built for maneuverability. If they could reach the asteroid field, they'd have a chance to lose them. The ship trembled as another near-miss sent energy waves rippling across the shields. Ethan glanced at Vena. "Tell me you've got another crazy plan." She gritted her teeth. "Just one." She pushed the ship to its limit, weaving between the asteroids at terrifying speeds. The Yeltrax fighters followed, but they weren't as agile. One clipped the edge of a massive rock, spinning out of control before erupting in a fiery explosion. Another fighter locked onto them, launching a missile. The tracking system beeped rapidly. Ethan's heart pounded. Missile incoming. Vena's fingers flew across the controls, deploying countermeasures. A series of bright flares shot from the ship, confusing the missile's tracking system. It veered off course, smashing into an asteroid instead. Ethan let out a breath. That was close. Vena wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked onto something ahead. Ethan followed her gaze. A massive Yeltrax battleship loomed in the distance, its weapons primed. Ethan's stomach sank. "You have got to be kidding me." Vena's expression hardened. "We can't outrun them." Ethan knew what that meant. Their escape wasn't over yet. They weren't just fighting for freedom anymore. They were fighting to survive. The scout ship rattled violently as a warning alarm blared through the cockpit. Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before another energy blast streaked past them, close enough to make the shields flicker. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the console. Vena's hands moved fast, pushing the ship to its limits as they weaved through the asteroid field. Behind them, The Yeltrax battleship loomed like a floating fortress, its massive cannons warming up for another shot. Smaller fighter ships swarmed around them, relentless in their pursuit. "We can't keep dodging forever," Ethan muttered, his eyes scanning the sensors. "They're herding us toward open space." Vena's jaw tightened. "I know." Another explosion rocked the ship, sending a cascade of sparks across the cockpit. One of the smaller fighters had managed to land a shot on their left wing. Ethan checked the status report. Damage was minimal, but they wouldn't last much longer if they didn't do something fast. Vena's voice was cold, calculating. "We have one option." Ethan glanced at her. "I'm listening." She flicked a switch, pulling up a tactical display of the battlefield. "We can't outrun them. We can't outgun them. But we can outthink them." Ethan frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Vena pointed to the asteroid field on the map. "We turn into it, deep into it." Ethan stared at her like she was crazy. "That's suicide. Half these rocks are moving at deadly speeds. If one hits us..." Vena cut him off. "If we stay out here, we're dead anyway." She wasn't wrong. The Yeltrax battleship was charging its main cannon, and their fighters were closing in fast. They had no real choice. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Fine. Do it." Without hesitation, Vena jerked the controls, and the scout ship veered sharply to the right, diving straight into the thick of the asteroid field. Instantly, the space around them turned into a chaotic mess of swirling rocks, some as small as pebbles, others the size of entire cities. They twisted and tumbled unpredictably, moving in every direction. Behind them, the Yeltrax fighters hesitated. They were fast, but not nearly as agile as Vena's stolen ship. Some of them tried to follow. One clipped the edge of an asteroid and exploded instantly. Ethan watched the debris scatter and allowed himself a brief smirk. That's one down. But the battleship wasn't deterred. A deep rumble filled the cockpit as the massive vessel fired its main cannon. A glowing energy beam cut through the asteroid field like a blade, vaporizing anything in its path. Vena swore under her breath and jerked the ship sideways, barely avoiding the destructive blast. Ethan clenched his fists. "We need to get out of here before they turn this entire field to dust." Vena's eyes narrowed. "I have an idea." She pushed the ship lower, weaving through the shifting debris at breakneck speed. Ethan struggled to keep up with her plan until he noticed the trajectory they were taking. She was leading them toward the biggest asteroid in the field, a massive, irregular rock with deep craters and jagged cliffs. Ethan's breath caught. "You're not seriously." "I am," Vena confirmed, accelerating. Ethan braced himself. "I really hope you know what you're doing." She didn't answer. The Yeltrax fighters, realizing they were being led into a trap, tried to slow down, but it was too late. Vena dove the ship straight into a narrow canyon along the asteroid's surface. The fighters followed, but their larger frames made it nearly impossible to maneuver. One clipped the canyon wall and exploded in a ball of fire. Another tried to pull up, only to smash into an overhanging rock. Ethan grinned. "That's two more." Vena wasn't smiling. "We're not done yet." The battleship had locked onto their position. Even from a distance, its weapons could still reach them. Another blast from its cannons ripped through the canyon walls, causing an avalanche of rock to collapse behind them. Ethan's eyes widened. "They're sealing us in." Vena's grip on the controls was firm. "Not if we escape first." She gunned the engines, sending the ship rocketing forward. They burst out of the canyon, barely squeezing through a collapsing gap in the asteroid's surface. Ethan let out a relieved laugh. But then his face fell as he noticed something on the scanner. The battleship was repositioning itself, lining up for one final, devastating shot. Vena saw it too. "We need cover. Now." Ethan scanned the asteroid's surface frantically. Then he saw it, a massive underground cavern hidden within the rock. The entrance was barely wide enough for their ship. He pointed. "There, that cave." Vena didn't hesitate. She aimed the ship straight for it. The battleship fired. The energy blast tore through space, just missing them as they dived into the cavern's entrance. A shockwave followed them inside, shaking the ship violently. For a few agonizing moments, everything was darkness. Then, the ship emerged into a vast underground chamber, illuminated by strange glowing minerals embedded in the walls. The cavern was big enough to hold a fleet, but more importantly, it was shielded from the Yeltrax scanners. They had disappeared. Vena exhaled slowly, easing the ship to a stop. "We're safe. For now." Ethan sagged in his seat, running a hand through his hair. That was insane. Vena's lips twitched into the faintest of smirks. It worked, didn't it? Ethan chuckled breathlessly. Yeah, it did. But he knew their fight wasn't over. They had escaped the Yeltrax battleship for now. But if they wanted to survive, if they wanted to win, they would have to find a way to strike back. The cavern was eerily silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship's systems as it rested on the rocky ground. Ethan unbuckled his harness and stood, stretching his sore muscles. The escape had been brutal, but they had survived. For now. Vena was already working at the ship's terminal, her fingers moving fast over the controls. Ethan stepped beside her, his eyes scanning the readouts. The Yeltrax battleship was still outside, its massive frame blocking out the stars. It hadn't left. It was waiting. "They know we're here," Vena murmured. Ethan nodded. "They're not going to stop until they have us." Vena leaned back, crossing her arms. "We can't run anymore. We have no escape routes left." Ethan clenched his fists. He knew she was right. They had been fighting nonstop, barely staying ahead of the Yeltrax forces. But now, they were cornered. And they were out of time. He exhaled slowly. "Then we make our stand here." Vena arched an eyebrow. "Against a Yeltrax battleship. You do realize we have a single scout ship, limited weapons, and a cavern for shelter." Ethan's lips curled into a grin. "That's all we need." Vena stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Ethan turned toward the ship's supply compartments and started pulling out everything they had: explosives, spare power cells, a few outdated drones. Not much, but enough for a plan. "We can't win in a direct fight," he explained, setting the equipment down. "But we don't have to. We just have to make sure they lose." Vena frowned. "You want to set traps?" Ethan nodded. "If we can lure them into this cavern, we can collapse it on them. Take out as many as possible." Vena hesitated. "And if they don't take the bait?" Ethan smirked. "They'll take it." Because if there was one thing he had learned about the Yeltrax, it was that they were overconfident. They believed in their superiority. They would send ground forces inside, thinking this would be an easy capture. And that would be their mistake. Vena sighed, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." They worked fast, setting up explosives along the cavern walls, placing motion-triggered charges at the entrance, and rigging the drones with power cells, turning them into makeshift bombs. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had. As they finished the final setup, a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the cavern. "They're coming," Vena whispered. Ethan grabbed his rifle and crouched behind a large rock formation. His heart pounded as heavy metallic footsteps filled the air. The Yeltrax were here. The first wave of soldiers entered cautiously, their armored suits reflecting the dim light of the cavern. They scanned the area, weapons raised. Ethan held his breath. Then, boom! The first explosive triggered, sending a wave of rock and fire crashing down on the Yeltrax soldiers. The ground shook violently, and several of them were buried under debris. The survivors reacted instantly, raising their weapons and firing in every direction. But there was nothing to shoot at. That's when the drones activated. They flew toward the remaining soldiers, their power cells overloading. Before the Yeltrax could react, boom! The cavern erupted in a series of explosions, cutting their numbers in half. Ethan didn't waste time. He emerged from cover, firing precise shots at the disoriented enemies. Vena followed, her blaster in hand, moving with deadly efficiency. The Yeltrax fought back hard, their advanced weapons tearing through the cavern walls. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and they didn't realize the biggest trap was still waiting. Ethan glanced at Vena. She gave a small nod. It was time. Ethan pulled out the remote detonator and pressed the button. The entire cavern rumbled as the final set of charges exploded, triggering a chain reaction. The ceiling above the Yeltrax forces collapsed, burying them under tons of rock. Silence followed. Then, a loud metallic groan filled the air. Ethan and Vena looked up just in time to see the impossible. The Yeltrax battleship was moving. The force of the cave-in had destabilized the rock formation above. Massive boulders tumbled down, slamming into the battleship's hull. Its engines flared, trying to escape, but it was too late. With a final, deafening roar, the battleship crashed into the asteroid's surface, breaking apart in a fiery explosion. Ethan and Vena barely managed to dive for cover as the shockwave sent debris flying in all directions. When the dust finally settled, Ethan slowly pushed himself up. The Yeltrax were gone. Vena sat up beside him, coughing. "Did we just?" Ethan laughed breathlessly. "Yeah, we did." They had won. The silence after the battle felt unreal. Smoke and dust still hung in the air, and the ground was littered with shattered rocks and burning wreckage. Ethan sat on the cold cavern floor, breathing heavily. His body ached, every muscle screaming in pain, but he was alive. Somehow, against impossible odds, they had won. Vena was beside him, resting against a large boulder, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her face was smeared with dirt and sweat. A deep cut ran across her forehead, but her golden eyes were still sharp. She stared at the destruction around them, taking in the wreckage of the Yeltrax battleship, the bodies of fallen soldiers, and the cave they had nearly been buried in. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Ethan let his head fall back, closing his eyes. He could still hear the echoes of battle, the gunfire, the explosions, the screams. He had lost count of how many times he had been on the brink of death in the past few hours. His entire body felt numb, but the weight in his chest wasn't from exhaustion. It was from something else. Loss. Not everyone had made it. Vena finally broke the silence, her voice quiet. "We need to check for survivors." Ethan opened his eyes, nodding. He pushed himself up, his legs unsteady beneath him. His rifle was still clutched in his hand, but there was no more need for it. He let it drop, the weapon clattering onto the stone floor. Vena offered a weak smile. "Still standing, soldier." Ethan gave a tired smirk. "Barely." Together, they moved through the ruins of their battlefield. The Yeltrax soldiers were motionless, their advanced armor now nothing more than twisted metal. The once mighty battleship, which had seemed invincible just hours ago, was now nothing more than a smoldering wreck. But Ethan wasn't looking for them. He was looking for his own people. As they moved further into the cavern, the weight in his chest grew heavier. He saw the bodies of those who had fought beside him, humans and aliens alike, brave warriors who had stood against an unstoppable enemy and paid the ultimate price. Ethan knelt beside one of them, Tarek, the young soldier who had joined them halfway through their escape. His armor was shattered, his helmet cracked. He had fought until the very end. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder and lowered his head. Vena stood beside him, her expression unreadable. He didn't run, even when he had the chance. Ethan swallowed hard. None of them did. One by one, they checked every fallen ally, hoping to find someone still breathing. But hope was a cruel thing. Then, a faint cough broke the silence. Ethan's head snapped up. He rushed toward the sound, pushing aside debris and broken equipment. And there, barely conscious, was Kale. His armor was cracked, His leg twisted at an unnatural angle, but his eyes flickered open when he saw Ethan. "You look like hell," Cale rasped. Ethan let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah, well, you're not looking great yourself." Vena knelt beside them, already working to stabilize Cal's injuries. "We need to get him to the ship. Now." Ethan nodded, gripping Cal's arm and pulling him up carefully. Cal grunted in pain, but managed to stay conscious. As they made their way back to the ship, Ethan took one last look at the battlefield. They had fought against impossible odds. They had survived. But at what cost? When they finally reached the ship, Ethan collapsed into the pilot's seat while Vena worked on Cal's wounds. The ship's systems flickered to life, the hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet cabin. Ethan stared at the controls, his fingers hovering over the throttle. They had won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Vena sat down beside him, silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You did it." Ethan exhaled slowly. "We did it." She turned to look at him, her golden eyes searching his face. "Not everyone could have pulled this off. You were the reason we made it." Ethan shook his head. "We lost too many." Vena reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "But we saved more. And because of that, their sacrifice wasn't in vain." Ethan let her words sink in. The weight in his chest was still there, but it wasn't as crushing as before. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a future. Vena gave him a small, tired smile. "So, where do we go from here?" Ethan glanced at her, then at Cal, who was barely awake but still alive. He thought about all the people they had lost, about the war that still wasn't over. Then he tightened his grip on the ship's controls. "Forward," he said. "We go forward." And with that, he launched the ship into the stars.